Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. If these stories bring you comfort, you're welcome to subscribe and join us on these quiet journeys. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep, to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The ovens held their heat long into the evening, radiating warmth that turned the bakehouse into a gentle refuge against the autumn chill outside. Margaret stood at the wooden work table, her hands resting on its flour-dusted surface, breathing in the mingled scents of the day's work: bread and cinnamon, vanilla and butter, the sweet ghost of raspberry jam that had filled the morning tarts. The bakehouse was her domain, had been for 15 years since she had taken over from old Mr. Pemberton. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Mill Street, with her small apartment above reached by an outside staircase. The shopfront faced the street, with its bow window displaying the day's offerings, while the bakehouse stretched behind, long and practical, lined with ovens and work surfaces, shelves of ingredients, hooks for tools. She had sent young Annie home an hour ago after the last customers had been served, and the shop swept clean. The girl was learning well, showed promise with pastry, but she was only 14 and needed her rest. Margaret herself had stayed, as she often did, to ready things for tomorrow's early start, to clean and organize, to simply be present in the quiet space she loved. The evening light came through the high windows in slanted beams, catching the flour dust that hung perpetually in the air and turning it to gold. Margaret moved through this light as she worked, wiping down surfaces, checking that bins of flour and sugar were properly sealed, ensuring everything was in its place. There was a meditation in these tasks, a settling of the day's energy into order and preparedness. She had been a pastry cook since she was Annie's age, had learned the trade from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before that. 3 generations of women working with flour and butter, sugar and eggs, creating sustenance and small beauties for their community. It was honest work, skilled work, and Margaret took pride in doing it well. The largest oven, the one used for bread, still radiated considerable heat. Margaret opened its door and peered inside, satisfied to see the bricks still glowing faintly orange. By morning, they would have cooled to the perfect temperature for the first loaves, would need only a small fire to bring them back to full heat. She closed the door gently, the iron handle warm under her palm. At the far end of the bakehouse, near the door that led to the small yard and her upstairs apartment, stood a tall cupboard painted cream, its paint worn at the handles from years of use. This was where Margaret kept her recipe collection, handwritten cards and folded papers, notebooks and loose sheets, all organized in a system only she fully understood. Some recipes were ancient, passed down through her family. Others she had developed herself through experimentation and practice. A few had been gifts from other bakers, trades made at the regional fairs, where pastry cooks gathered to share techniques and news. Margaret went to this cupboard now, intending to select tomorrow's special items. She liked to offer something beyond the daily bread and standard cakes, something that would surprise and delight her customers. A cardamom bun, perhaps, or the little jam tarts that children loved. She opened the cupboard and began to leaf through the cards, reading familiar recipes in familiar hands. As she sorted through the middle shelf, her fingers encountered something unexpected. Tucked between two recipe notebooks, pressed flat and nearly forgotten, was a card she did not immediately recognize. She drew it out carefully and carried it to the work table, where the evening light fell strongest. The card was older than most in her collection, its edges soft and slightly yellowed. The handwriting on it was elegant, feminine, formed with the careful loops and flourishes of an earlier generation. At the top, in slightly larger letters, was written, "Grandmother's honey cake, for special occasions." Margaret's breath caught. She knew this handwriting. It was her grandmother's, though she had never seen this particular recipe before. Her grandmother had died when Margaret was 12, but not before teaching her granddaughter the fundamentals of baking, the feel of properly kneaded dough, the sound of a cake that was done. Those lessons had been the foundation of everything Margaret knew. She read the recipe slowly, taking in each ingredient, each instruction. It called for honey and dark molasses, warm spices and black tea, orange zest, and a touch of black pepper. The method was precise but not fussy, written in her grandmother's practical style. At the bottom of the card, in the same flowing hand, was a note. "Bake this with love, Margaret, when you need to remember that you are not alone. The scent will bring me near." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The card was meant for her, specifically for her, though she had never known of its existence. How had it come to be tucked away in the cupboard? Had her mother placed it there, knowing Margaret would find it someday? Or had it been there all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? She read the recipe again, more slowly this time, imagining her grandmother's hands writing these words, selecting this recipe, adding that final loving note. Honey cake was not something Margaret baked regularly. It was old-fashioned, the kind of thing people had made in her grandmother's youth but rarely requested now. Yet reading the recipe, she could almost smell it, could almost taste its deep, complex sweetness. Margaret laid the recipe card on the work table and simply looked at it for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on its edges. The bakehouse was very quiet, the only sound the settling of cooling ovens and the distant call of a street vendor making his final rounds. Outside, the autumn evening was drawing in, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. She made her decision without conscious thought, her body knowing before her mind fully articulated it. She would bake this cake tonight. She would follow her grandmother's instructions, would measure and mix and create something that would bridge the years between them, would bring the past into gentle conversation with the present. First, though, she needed to check her supplies. Margaret moved to the storage area where ingredients were kept in bins and jars, on shelves, and in the cool larder. She brought the recipe card with her, consulting it as she gathered what she would need. Honey. She had several jars of it, purchased from the beekeeper who lived beyond the common. The honey was local, thick and golden, tasting of the wildflowers that grew in the meadows. Margaret selected a jar and held it up to the light. watching the honey move slowly inside, heavy and rich. Her grandmother would have used honey just like this, probably from the same meadows, perhaps from the grandfather of the current beekeeper. Molasses came next, dark and almost black, with its distinctive bittersweet depth. Margaret kept it in a stoneware jar with a tight-fitting lid. She lifted it down from its shelf, feeling its substantial weight. The molasses had come from the West Indies, had travelled across oceans to reach this small bakehouse on Mill Street, carrying with it the warmth of distant sunshine. The spices her grandmother's recipe called for were ones Margaret used regularly: cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and yes, a touch of black pepper for complexity. She kept these in small tins, carefully labelled, arranged in alphabetical order on a narrow shelf. Margaret gathered them and set them beside the honey and molasses, creating a small assembly of ingredients. Black tea. The recipe specified it should be strong, brewed and cooled before being added to the batter. Margaret went to the small corner where she kept a kettle and her personal tea, things the bakehouse was too warm most days for hot drinks. But she liked having the option. She filled the kettle from the water barrel and set it on the still warm brick surface near the bread oven's door. It would take a few minutes to heat, would give her time to gather the remaining ingredients. Flour, of course. The recipe called for ordinary wheat flour, not the fine pastry flour Margaret used for delicate cakes. She measured out what she would need from the large bin, using the scoop that hung beside it, letting the flour fall into her mixing bowl in a soft cascade. Flour was the foundation of all her work, so familiar she barely thought about it anymore. Yet each batch was slightly different, responding to weather and storage, to humidity and temperature. She had learned to judge flour by touch and sight, to know when it needed more liquid or less, when it would produce a light crumb or a dense one. Eggs came from the basket she kept in the coolest corner of the larder. She selected 4, checking each one for cracks, feeling their weight and freshness in her palm. The chickens that had laid these eggs lived in a coop behind the greengrocer's shop, 3 doors down. Margaret knew them by sight, knew which hen laid the largest eggs, which ones produced shells in shades of pale brown, and which ones laid cream-colored eggs. These small connections, these threads that wove through the community, were part of what made her work meaningful. Butter, sugar, salt, baking powder. Margaret gathered these familiar staples, the building blocks of her trade. She had used them thousands of times in countless combinations, but tonight they would come together in her grandmother's pattern, would create something specific and memory-laden. The kettle began to sing, steam rising from its spout. Margaret measured tea leaves into a small pot, good black tea, strong and malty, and poured the boiling water over them. The scent rose up, earthy and complex, and she set the pot aside to steep while she continued her preparations. Orange zest. The recipe called for the zest of 1 orange, and Margaret fetched an orange from the bowl of fruit she kept for pastry making. She held it to her nose, breathing in its bright citrus scent, then selected a fine grater from the rack of tools on the wall. The bakehouse was fully equipped with every implement a baker might need, accumulated over years of work, each tool chosen for its quality and kept in perfect condition. Margaret arranged all the ingredients on the work table in the order she would use them, creating a kind of map of the recipe before her. This was her practice, her way of ensuring she would not miss anything, would not have to stop mid-process to search for a forgotten item. Everything was present, ready, waiting for her hands to transform it from separate elements into a unified whole. She poured the steeped tea through a strainer into a measuring cup, watching its dark color, breathing its fragrant steam. It needed to cool, so she set it near an open window where the evening air could work on it. While she waited, she tied on a clean apron, washed her hands thoroughly at the deep sink, and lit the lamps that hung above the work table. The natural light was fading, and she wanted to see clearly for the work ahead. The bakehouse settled into its evening aspect, warm and lamplit, full of good sense and the promise of creation. Margaret returned to the work table and read through the recipe once more, fixing the steps in her mind. Then she reached for the butter and began. Margaret had creamed butter and sugar together countless times in her years as a baker, but she approached the task now with fresh attention, as though doing it for the first time. The butter was cool, but not cold, exactly the right consistency for incorporating air. She cut it into chunks and placed them in her largest earthenware bowl, the one with the chip on its rim that she had used since her apprentice days. The sugar followed, its crystals catching the lamplight like tiny diamonds. Margaret used a wooden spoon, her favorite, its handle worn smooth by years of use, shaped to her grip as perfectly as if it had been carved specifically for her hand. She began to work the butter and sugar together, pressing and stirring, folding and turning, feeling the mixture change under her spoon. This was the foundation of the cake, this careful blending of fat and sweetness. The sugar crystals cut into the butter, creating tiny air pockets that would help the cake rise and give it texture. Margaret worked steadily, her arm moving in rhythmic circles, watching the mixture pale from yellow to cream as air was incorporated. The physical work was satisfying, grounding, connecting her to every baker who had ever performed this same basic task. When the butter and sugar reached the proper consistency, light and fluffy, nearly doubled in volume. Margaret set down her spoon and flexed her hand. She cracked the eggs into a small bowl, checking each one before adding it to the mixture. The eggs went in one at a time, each fully incorporated before the next was added. She watched the emulsion form, fat and liquid coming together into a smooth, cohesive mass. The honey came next, measured carefully from the jar. It fell from the measuring cup in a thick golden stream, coiling upon itself where it landed in the bowl. Margaret worked it in slowly, feeling the batter loosen and become more liquid. The honey added its own subtle fragrance, floral and warm, a scent that spoke of summer meadows and patient bees. The molasses followed, dark against the pale batter, turning everything a rich brown as Margaret stirred it in. This was the heart of the cake's flavor, the molasses, with its complex notes of caramel and toast, slight bitterness underlying the sweetness. Her grandmother must have loved this depth, Margaret thought, this refusal of simple sweetness in favor of something more complex, more interesting. She grated the orange zest directly into the bowl, watching the bright shavings fall onto the dark batter. The fragrance that rose up was immediate and cheerful, cutting through the heavier scents of molasses and honey. Margaret stirred it in, then paused to taste a tiny bit of the batter from her spoon. The flavor was developing well, all the elements present but not yet harmonized. waiting for heat to transform them. The cool tea went in next, turning the batter even more liquid. Margaret had wondered about this when she first read the recipe. Tea in a cake seemed unusual, but now she understood. The tea's tannins would add another layer of complexity, a slight astringency that would balance the sweetness, and its liquid would help create a moist crumb. Now for the dry ingredients. Margaret measured flour into a separate bowl, adding to it the baking powder, salt, and spices. The spices needed to be measured carefully. Too much, and they would overwhelm; too little, and they would disappear into the background. She used measuring spoons her mother had given her, worn brass ones that had measured spices for 3 generations of bakers. Cinnamon went in first, its warm brown powder familiar and comforting. Then ginger, sharp and bright. Cloves, pungent and slightly medicinal. Nutmeg, sweet and complex. And finally, just a few grinds of black pepper from the mill. So little that no one would identify it as pepper, but enough to add a subtle warmth, a gentle heat underneath everything else. Margaret stirred the dry ingredients together, distributing the spices evenly through the flour. This was important. Spices added directly to wet ingredients could clump, creating pockets of intense flavor rather than an even distribution. She stirred until she could see no streaks, until the flour had taken on a uniform brown color from the spices. The final step was to combine wet and dry, and this required a gentle hand. Margaret added the flour mixture to the batter in thirds, stirring just until combined after each addition. Overworking the batter at this stage would develop the gluten in the flour, making the cake tough instead of tender. She worked with smooth, deliberate movements, watching the batter come together, seeing the transformation from separate parts to unified whole. When the last of the flour had been incorporated, Margaret set down her spoon and simply looked at the batter. It was dark and lustrous, thick but pourable, fragrant with spices and honey. She dipped a clean spoon into it and tasted again. Yes, this was right. This was what her grandmother had intended. She had prepared a cake tin earlier, greasing it with butter and dusting it with flour. And now she poured the batter into it, scraping the bowl with a rubber spatula to ensure she got every bit. The batter settled into the tin with a satisfying heaviness, and Margaret smoothed its top with the back of the spoon, creating an even surface that would bake uniformly. The bread oven had cooled to the perfect temperature for cake baking. Margaret had been monitoring it throughout the mixing process, had adjusted the dampers to control the heat, had learned over the years to judge temperature by feel rather than relying on thermometers. She held her hand inside the oven door, counting slowly, feeling the way the heat enveloped her skin without burning. Yes, this was right. She slid the cake tin onto the oven's middle rack, positioned so heat would circulate evenly around it. The door closed with a solid sound, sealing the cake into its transformative chamber. Now came the waiting, the patient attendance that baking required. Margaret could not rush this part, could not make the cake bake faster through will or desire. She could only trust in the process, in the reliable alchemy of heat and time. She set a timer more habit than necessity, as she had an internal sense of time developed through years of practice, and began to clean up. The bowls and spoons went into the deep sink, where she washed them in water heated on the stove. The work table was wiped clean of flour and sugar, returned to its neutral state. The unused ingredients were returned to their proper storage places. These tasks, too, were part of the meditation of baking. The work did not end with the mixing. It extended through the cleaning and organizing, the restoration of order. Margaret had learned this from her mother, who had learned it from her grandmother. A baker's workspace should be clean and ready, should welcome the next task, rather than presenting obstacles of dirty tools and disordered supplies. As she worked, the scent of the baking cake began to fill the bakehouse. It started subtly, just a hint of sweetness in the air, then grew stronger as the cake heated and its volatile compounds were released. Margaret paused in her cleaning to simply breathe, to let the scent wash over her. It smelled like memory, like childhood and safety, like a grandmother's kitchen on cold afternoons, like celebrations and ordinary Tuesdays, like love made tangible through the medium of flour and eggs and patient attention. The scent carried her backward through the years, even as she stood firmly in the present, and she felt the truth of her grandmother's note. The scent did indeed bring her near. Margaret finished her cleaning and made herself a cup of tea, using the leaves she had brewed for the cake. She carried the cup to the tall stool near the work table and sat, sipping slowly, watching the play of lamplight on the clean surfaces around her. The bakehouse at night was a different place than during the day. Without customers and activity, it became contemplative, a space for thought and feeling. She thought about her grandmother, trying to remember details that time had softened. The way she had hummed while she worked, old songs from her own childhood. The way her hands had moved, quick and sure, never wasting emotion. The way she had tasted everything, developing her palate, teaching Margaret to do the same. "You must know what you're creating," she had said. "Must understand each ingredient and how it contributes to the whole." Those lessons had shaped Margaret's approach to baking, had made her more than just someone who followed recipes. She understood the why behind the what, knew when she could adjust and adapt, when she needed to follow instructions precisely. This knowledge was her grandmother's gift, more valuable than any recipe, though the recipes themselves were treasured too. The timer chimed softly, and Margaret rose to check the cake. She opened the oven door carefully, letting out a wave of fragrant heat. The cake had risen beautifully, its top domed and golden brown. She inserted a clean knife into its center, and it came out clean. The cake was done. Using thick cloths to protect her hands, Margaret lifted the cake tin from the oven and set it on a wire rack to cool. The cake's surface was slightly cracked, a normal characteristic of this type of dense, moist cake. Steam rose from it, carrying the concentrated scent of all its ingredients in harmony. She resisted the urge to turn it out of the tin immediately. The cake needed time to settle, to firm up slightly so it wouldn't crumble when removed from the pan. This waiting was another lesson in patience, another reminder that baking operated on its own schedule. Margaret returned to her tea, now lukewarm but still pleasant. She sat and watched the cake cool, watched steam gradually cease rising from its surface, watched the tin lose its too hot-to-touch quality and become merely warm. The bakehouse settled around her, the ovens ticking as they cooled, the building itself creaking slightly as it adjusted to the temperature change between day and night. After 20 minutes, Margaret judged the cake ready to unmold. She ran a thin knife around the edges of the tin, loosening any spots where the cake might have stuck. Then she placed a wire cooling rack over the top of the tin, held both firmly, and flipped them over together. The cake released with a soft sound and settled onto the rack, revealing its bottom now, its top in perfect condition, evenly browned and smooth. Margaret turned the cake right side up and stood back to look at it. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a rounded dome of deep brown, its surface showing the slight cracks that spoke of its rich, moist nature. She touched its top gently, feeling the spring of a well-baked crumb, and smiled. The cake needed to cool completely before it could be properly tasted, but Margaret knew she would not wait that long. One of the privileges of baking alone in one's own bakehouse was the freedom to break one's own rules. She would cut a small slice from the cake while it was still warm, would taste it in the state between fresh from oven and fully cooled, would experience it as a work in progress. She busied herself with other small tasks, while the cake cooled enough to slice without crumbling. She swept the floor, checked that all the ovens were properly dammed for the night, made notes in her order book about what she would need to purchase from the wholesaler next week. But part of her attention remained on the cake, on its gradual cooling, on the way its scent continued to evolve as different compounds became volatile at different temperatures. When she judged the time right, Margaret selected a long serrated knife from her rack of tools and approached the cake. She cut into it slowly, the knife moving easily through the tender crumb. The slice she removed was generous, showing the cake's even texture, its deep brown color studded here and there, with slightly darker spots where spices had concentrated. She placed the slice on a small plate, one of the simple white ones she kept for her own use, and carried it to her stool. For a moment, she simply looked at it, at this tangible result of her grandmother's recipe, of her own work, of the mysterious appearance of the card that had set this evening's task in motion. Then Margaret picked up a fork and took her first bite. The flavor was complex, unfolding in layers. First came the sweetness of honey and molasses, then the warmth of spices, cinnamon most prominent, but with ginger and cloves supporting it, and underneath everything, the subtle heat of black pepper and the earthy note of the black tea. The orange zest sang out in the finish, bright and clean, cutting through the richness and leaving her palate refreshed rather than overwhelmed. The texture was perfect, moist but not heavy, tender but with enough structure to hold together well. The crumb was even and fine, the result of proper mixing and the right oven temperature. Margaret took another bite, chewing slowly, analyzing what she tasted, understanding how each ingredient contributed to the whole. It was, she realized, quite possibly the best cake she had ever made, not because of her own skill, though that mattered, but because of something else, something intangible that had come through in the baking. Love, perhaps, memory, connection across time, her grandmother's presence, somehow woven into the very structure of the cake. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were not sad tears. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of feeling profoundly not alone in the world. Her grandmother had known she would need this someday, had left this gift knowing it would find Margaret at exactly the right moment. She finished her slice slowly, savoring each bite, then sat with the empty plate in her lap. Outside, full night had fallen. The street was quiet, except for the occasional footstep of someone making their way home. Inside the bakehouse, The lamps cast pools of warm light, and the lingering scent of spices and honey filled the air. Margaret rose and cut another slice of the cake, this one smaller. She wrapped it carefully in parchment paper, tied it with string, and wrote on it in pencil, "For Mrs. Chen, with thanks for her kindness." Mrs. Chen ran the grocer's shop next door and had been unfailingly kind to Margaret over the years, always ready with a smile, always willing to watch the bakehouse for a few minutes if Margaret needed to step out. She cut another slice and wrapped it. "For Father Michael, for Sunday's tea." The priest at St. Catherine's had been a steady customer for years, buying bread every morning on his walk back from early Mass. They had fallen into a pattern of comfortable conversation, never intrusive, but always warm. Another slice for Annie to take home. Her young apprentice worked hard and had a family of 6 to feed at home. An unexpected treat would brighten their table. Margaret continued until she had set aside 6 slices, each one wrapped and labeled for someone who had touched her life with kindness or care. It felt right to share the cake, to let it become a vehicle for connection and gratitude. Her grandmother would have approved, Margaret thought. She had been a great believer in the power of shared food to strengthen community bonds. The cake that remained was still substantial, more than enough for her own enjoyment over the coming days. Margaret covered it with a clean cloth and set it in the larder where it would stay fresh. Honey cakes actually improved with a day or two of rest, their flavors melding and deepening. By tomorrow, it would be even better than tonight. Margaret gathered the wrapped slices and arranged them in a small basket, one she used sometimes for deliveries. In the morning, before she began the day's baking, she would deliver these small gifts, would see the surprise and pleasure on her neighbors' faces, would participate in the giving that her grandmother's recipe had inspired. But for now, the evening's work was complete. The cake was baked, the bakehouse was clean, and everything was ready for tomorrow's early start. Margaret moved through the space one final time, checking each station, ensuring all was as it should be. The ovens were cooling properly, the flour bins were sealed, the work surfaces were clean, everything in order, everything in its place. She extinguished the lamps one by one, leaving only the small one she would carry with her to light her way up the outside stairs to her apartment. The bakehouse settled into darkness, still warm from the day's work, still fragrant with the scent of honey cake and spices. Margaret stepped out into the small yard behind the building, closing the bakehouse door firmly behind her. The night air was cool and fresh after the warmth inside, carrying the scent of autumn wood smoke and fallen leaves, the earthy smell of gardens settling into dormancy. Above, stars were beginning to emerge in the patches of sky visible between buildings. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, her hand on the railing worn smooth by years of use, the basket of wrapped cake slices over her other arm. The stairs creaked slyly under her feet, a familiar sound, comforting in its constancy. At the top, she unlocked her door and stepped into her small home. The apartment was modest but comfortable, reflecting Margaret's practical nature. A sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom just large enough for a bed and wardrobe, a tiny kitchen she rarely used since she had access to the bakehouse below. The walls were painted cream and the furniture was simple but well made. On the mantelpiece sat a framed photograph of her grandmother, taken when she was about Margaret's age. standing in front of a bakehouse that might have been this very one. Margaret set the basket on the table and lit the lamp in her sitting room. She poked up the fire she had banked that morning, adding a few pieces of coal to warm the space. Then she settled into her favorite chair, a worn armchair that had belonged to her mother, and allowed herself to simply sit and be still. The day's work was done. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and challenges, its own satisfactions and small victories. But tonight, this moment, was for rest and reflection. Margaret sat in the lamplight and thought about her grandmother, about the mysterious appearance of the recipe card, about the cake that now rested in the larder below. She thought about the women who had come before her in this trade, each one passing knowledge and skill to the next, creating an unbroken chain of care and competence that stretched back through generations. She was part of that chain, a link between past and future, keeper of recipes and techniques that might otherwise be lost. The responsibility of it was balanced by the gift of it. Margaret had not chosen this path alone. It had been offered to her by her mother and grandmother, had been presented as a possibility, a way of being in the world. And she had accepted it, had made it her own, had found in it a source of meaning and purpose that sustained her through ordinary days and difficult ones alike. Tomorrow she would deliver the slices of cake, would see them received with pleasure, would participate in the small exchanges that knit a community together. The next day, she would bake the cake again, would offer it in the shop alongside her regular offerings, would see if it found favor with her customers. If it did, she might make it a regular item, might add it to her repertoire of specialties. But tonight, sitting in her chair with the fire warming the room and the memory of her grandmother's cake still on her palate, Margaret simply rested. She thought about the bakehouse below, dark now but ready for tomorrow. She thought about the ovens that would heat again before dawn, about the bread she would make, about the endless cycle of creation and consumption that was a baker's life. It was good work, she thought, honest work, work that fed people, that brought small pleasures into ordinary days, that connected her to her community in immediate and tangible ways. Every loaf of bread, every cake and pastry was an offering, a way of saying, I see you, I care for you, I want you to be nourished and pleased. Margaret rose from her chair and went to the bedroom to prepare for sleep. She changed into her nightgown, braided her hair, washed her face in the basin on the washstand. These small rituals of the evening, performed countless times, never losing their power to signal transition, to mark the boundary between day and night, work and rest. She climbed into bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin. The bed was comfortable, familiar, the mattress shaped by years of her sleeping in the same position. Through the window, she could see a patch of sky, stars bright in the clear autumn night. She watched them for a moment, thinking about her grandmother watching these same stars, or stars like them, all those years ago. Thank you, Margaret whispered into the darkness. Thank you for the recipe, for the reminder, for everything you taught me. The stars offered no answer, but none was needed. The gift had been given and received, the connection acknowledged. Margaret closed her eyes and felt sleep beginning to gather at the edges of her consciousness, soft and welcome. Margaret woke before dawn, as she always did, her body attuned to the rhythms of her work even without the aid of a clock. She rose and dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on her work dress and apron, pinning up her hair. The apartment was cool but not cold, the banked fire still holding a breath of warmth. She descended the outside stairs carrying her lamp, her breath visible in the chilly air. The town was still largely asleep. Only a few lights visible in windows where other early risers were beginning their days. Margaret unlocked the bakehouse and stepped into its familiar embrace, breathing in the scent that still lingered from last night's baking. She lit the lamps and began the process of heating the ovens, a task so practiced she could do it almost without thought. Kindling first, carefully arranged to catch easily, then larger pieces of wood positioned to allow good airflow. The fire caught and grew, and Margaret fed it gradually, building the heat that would transform today's dough into bread. While the ovens heated, she retrieved the basket of wrapped cake slices from the larder. The cake itself looked beautiful in the morning light, its deep brown color rich and inviting. Margaret cut one more slice for herself breakfast and sat at the work table to eat it. The cake had indeed improved overnight, its flavors more integrated, more harmonious than they had been fresh from the oven. When the first oven reached the right temperature, Margaret began the day's bread baking. This was automatic work, her hands knowing what to do without conscious direction. Shape the loaves, score the tops, slide them into the oven. The rhythm of it was soothing, grounding, a way of entering fully into the day's work. As the bread baked, filling the bakehouse with its warm, yeasty scent, Margaret prepared the morning's pastries, sweet rolls with cinnamon, fruit tarts with the last of the season's apples, simple butter biscuits. Annie would arrive soon to help with the finishing work and to tend the shop when it opened. At 7 o'clock, with the first loaves cooling on racks and the pastries ready for the oven, Margaret took the basket of wrapped cake slices and stepped out into the morning. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The street was coming to life, shop owners opening their doors, early workers making their way to their employment. Mrs. Chen was sweeping the pavement in front of her grocery when Margaret approached. The older woman looked up and smiled, her face creasing into familiar lines of welcome. "Good morning, Margaret. You're out and about early, even for you." "Good morning, Mrs. Chen. I wanted to bring you something." Margaret retrieved the wrapped slice from her basket and offered it. "I baked a special cake last night from my grandmother's recipe. I thought you might enjoy it." Mrs. Chen's face softened as she accepted the package. "How thoughtful of you, dear. I'll have it with my morning tea." "Thank you." The exchange was simple but warm, a small moment of connection that brightened both their mornings. Margaret continued on her way, delivering the other slices to their intended recipients. Father Michael, encountered on his way back from early Mass, accepted his slice with gratitude and a blessing. Annie's mother, answering the door in her apron with a baby on her hip, looked genuinely touched by the gift. Each delivery was brief but meaningful, each one received with pleasure and thanks. Margaret walked back to the bakehouse as the town fully woke around her, feeling lighter for having shared her grandmother's cake, for having participated in the give and take that made a community more than just a collection of individuals living in proximity. Annie was waiting when Margaret returned, already tying on her apron, ready to begin the day's work. The girl was bright-eyed and eager, reminding Margaret of herself at that age, full of energy and interest in learning the baker's craft. "Good morning, Miss Margaret. The bread smells wonderful." "Good morning, Annie. Thank you. We have a full day ahead. I thought we might try something new." Margaret showed Annie the honey cake, explained its history, and suggested they make another to offer in the shop. Annie listened attentively, asking good questions about technique and ingredients, and together they set about preparing another batch of the batter, working alongside Annie, guiding her hands in the mixing, explaining the why behind each step. Margaret felt her grandmother's presence strongly. This was how knowledge passed down, how skills were preserved and extended. This was the chain of care and competence, continuing into another generation. The morning passed in productive bustle. The second honey cake went into the oven, and when it emerged, golden and fragrant, Annie clapped her hands in delight. "It's beautiful, Miss Margaret. It smells even better than the bread." Margaret smiled at the girl's enthusiasm. "Let it cool, and then you can taste it. Meanwhile, let's get everything ready for opening." They arranged the bread on the shelves behind the shop counter, round loaves of white bread, longer loaves of brown, specialty breads with seeds or dried fruit. The pastries went onto platters, displayed to show their appeal. And in a place of prominence, on a special stand, they set the honey cake with a handwritten card beside it. "Grandmother's honey cake, a special recipe." When they opened the shop doors at 8 o'clock, the morning customers were already waiting. The regulars came first, those who stopped every day for their bread, who knew exactly what they wanted, and exchanged a few pleasant words before going on their way. Margaret greeted each by name, asked after families, remembered preferences and dietary needs. Mrs. Blackwood, the school teacher, noticed the honey cake immediately. "That's new, isn't it? It looks interesting." "It's a recipe from my grandmother," Margaret explained. "I found the card unexpectedly yesterday evening and decided to make it. Would you like to try a slice?" Mrs. Blackwood agreed, and Margaret cut her a generous portion. The teacher tasted it thoughtfully, her eyes widening slightly. "This is excellent, really quite special. The spices are beautifully balanced." Word spread through the morning customers, and several others requested slices. By mid-morning, half the cake was gone, and Margaret had taken several orders for whole cakes to be picked up later in the week. The response was more enthusiastic than she had anticipated, and she made a note to bake 2 more honey cakes this afternoon. During a lull in customers, Annie approached Margaret hesitantly. "Miss Margaret, would it be all right if I tried a small piece of the cake? I'd like to taste what we made." "Of course, Annie. Every baker should taste her own work. It's how you learn." Margaret cut a slice for Annie and watched the girl taste it. Annie chewed slowly, her young face serious with concentration. "It's different from what we usually make," she said finally. "Deeper, more complicated. I can taste the honey and the spices and something else I can't quite name." "That's the molasses," Margaret said, "and the black tea. Those are the elements that give it depth. You have a good palate, Annie. That will serve you well as you develop your skills." The girl beamed at the praise, and Margaret felt again that sense of continuity, of knowledge passing from one generation to the next. Annie reminded her of herself at that age, curious and attentive, eager to learn and understand. Given time and guidance, the girl would become an excellent baker in her own right. The afternoon brought a different rhythm to the shop. The bread was mostly sold by noon, and the customers who came in the afternoon were often looking for treats rather than staples cakes for special occasions, pastries for tea, small indulgences to brighten ordinary days. Mr. Peterson, who ran the hardware shop down the street, came in to order a cake for his wife's birthday. When he saw the honey cake, he asked about it, and Margaret told him the story of finding her grandmother's recipe. He listened with interest, then said, "I'll take a whole honey cake instead of the usual birthday cake. My wife loves anything with spices, and I think the story behind it will mean more to her than just a regular cake." Margaret accepted the order, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I'll bake it fresh tomorrow morning, so it will be perfect for her birthday on Friday." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret and Annie baked the 2 additional honey cakes, filling the bakehouse once again with their distinctive scent. Customers commented on the wonderful smell, and several placed orders without even having tasted the cake yet, trusting Margaret's skill and drawn by the fragrance alone. At 4 o'clock, Margaret sent Annie home. The girl had worked hard all day, had learned several new techniques, and deserved her rest. "Take one of the sweet rolls home with you," Margaret said, wrapping one in paper. "You did well today." After Annie left, Margaret spent an hour preparing for the next day's baking. She measured out flour, checked her supplies of other ingredients, made notes about special orders. The honey cakes cooling on their racks were destined for various purposes. One to be sold by the slice in the shop, one to be delivered to Mr. Peterson on Friday, one to keep for her own consumption and to continue offering samples. The shop closed at 6, and Margaret swept the floor, wiped down the counter, and recorded the day's sales in her ledger. It had been a good day, productive and profitable, but more than that, it had been a day of connection and meaning. The honey cake had created conversations, had sparked stories about people's own grandmothers and family recipes, had reminded everyone that food was about more than just nutrition. It was about memory and love and connection across time. With the shop closed and the bakehouse tidied, Margaret found herself drawn once again to the work table, where she had baked the first honey cake. She lit a lamp against the gathering dusk and sat on her tall stool, the recipe card in her hands, reading her grandmother's words once more. "Bake this with love, Margaret, when you need to remember that you are not alone." She understood now, more fully than she had last night, what her grandmother had meant. The cake itself was delicious, but its real purpose was to create connections. To the past through memory, to the present through sharing, to the future through teaching Annie and others who would carry the recipe forward. Margaret was not alone. She was part of a lineage of bakers, connected to her grandmother and mother, connected to Annie and whatever apprentices might come after her. She was connected to her community through the daily exchange of bread and conversation, through the small acts of kindness like the slices she had delivered this morning. She was woven into a network of care and reciprocity that sustained her as surely as food sustained the body. The recipe card had appeared exactly when she needed it, though she hadn't known she needed it until it arrived. There had been no crisis in her life, no particular hardship or loneliness, but there had been a kind of settling, a taking for granted of the patterns of her days, a forgetting to notice the gifts embedded in her ordinary life. The cake had reminded her, had awakened her to the beauty of her work, to the meaning in small acts of care, to the love that could be baked into a simple dessert and shared with others. It had reminded her of her grandmother's love, yes, but also of her own capacity to love, to create, to give. Margaret carefully tucked the recipe card into her personal recipe book, the one she kept separate from the shop's collection. This one was hers alone, filled with favorites and experiments, with recipes that mattered to her personally. Her grandmother's honey cake belonged here, among the recipes that fed her soul as much as her body. She rose from the stool and made a slow circuit of the bakehouse, touching surfaces as she passed: the smooth wood of the work table, the warm brick of the ovens, the cool metal of the mixing bowls. This space was her domain, her place of creation and competence. She knew it intimately, knew every quirk and characteristic, knew how the light fell at different times of day, knew where the floorboards creaked, knew which oven ran slightly hotter than the others. It was not just a workplace. It was a home in its own way, a place where she belonged as fully as in the apartment upstairs, perhaps more so, because this was where she was most truly herself, where her skills and knowledge found their fullest expression. Through the high windows, Margaret could see the evening star emerging in the twilight sky. The street outside was quiet now. The workday ended. Families gathered for their evening meals. Many of those meals would include bread she had baked, would be eaten at tables where her pastries sat on plates, where her cakes marked celebrations and ordinary Tuesdays alike. The thought filled her with quiet satisfaction. This was her contribution, her way of caring for the community that supported her business and her life. She fed them, and in doing so, she fed herself not just with income, but with purpose and meaning. Margaret extinguished most of the lamps, leaving only the one she would carry upstairs. She took a final look around the bakehouse, ensuring all was secure for the night, then stepped out into the yard and locked the door behind her. The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of autumn more strongly now that the sun had set. Margaret climbed the stairs to her apartment, her body tired from the day's work, but her spirit refreshed by the honey cake's unexpected appearance and the connections it had fostered. Inside her apartment, she lit the lamps and stirred up the fire. She prepared a simple supper bread, of course, and cheese, a few slices of cold meat, an apple from the bowl on the table. She ate slowly, savoring the quiet of the evening, thinking about tomorrow's baking, about the orders she needed to fill, about Annie's progress and potential. After supper, Margaret sat in her chair by the fire and picked up the book she was reading, a novel borrowed from the lending library. But her mind wandered from the pages, returning again and again to the honey cake, to her grandmother, to the mysterious way the recipe card had appeared exactly when it was meant to. Perhaps there was no mystery really. Perhaps her mother had tucked it into the cupboard years ago, knowing Margaret would find it eventually. Or perhaps it had been there all along and Margaret simply hadn't seen it until she was ready to see it. Either way, the timing felt providential, felt like a gift from beyond time. Margaret set the book aside and simply sat, watching the firelight play on the walls, listening to the quiet sounds of the building settling around her. These moments of stillness were precious, necessary counterpoints to the activity of her days. She needed both the purposeful busyness of baking and serving customers, and these quiet interludes of rest and reflection. Tomorrow would bring more of both, more bread to bake, more customers to serve, more small exchanges that knit the community together. And in the evening, more quiet time to reflect, to rest, to prepare for the day after that. The rhythm was sustainable, satisfying, a good way to live a life. Margaret prepared for bed with the same careful attention she brought to her baking. She washed her face and hands, braided her hair, changed into her nightgown. Each small action was performed mindfully, marking the transition from day to night, from activity to rest. She climbed into bed and pulled the quilts up, their weight comforting and familiar. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the clear sky, brilliant and distant. Margaret watched them for a while, thinking about all the people throughout history who had looked up at these same stars, who had found comfort in their constancy, their reliable presence night after night. Her grandmother had watched these stars. Her mother had watched them. And Annie, perhaps, was watching them right now from her family's cottage on the edge of town. The same stars, connecting them across time and distance, reminding them that they were part of something larger than themselves. Margaret thought about the honey cake resting in the larder below, about the slices that had been shared with neighbors and friends, about the orders waiting to be filled. Such a simple thing. Really flour and eggs, honey and spices, mixed together and transformed by heat. And yet not simple at all, because it carried within it love and memory, care and connection, the accumulated knowledge of generations. "Thank you," Margaret whispered again into the darkness, speaking to her grandmother, to the universe, to the mysterious benevolence that had brought the recipe card into her hands. "Thank you for the reminder, for the gift, for everything." The stars shone on, silent and steadfast. The town around her was settling into sleep, lights extinguishing in windows, the streets emptying as people found their way home and to their beds. Margaret could feel herself settling too, her breathing slowing, her thoughts growing quieter. She thought about tomorrow, about the bread she would bake, about Annie's bright face and eager questions, about the customers who would come through the shop door. She thought about the rhythm of the work, the satisfaction of it, the way it gave shape and purpose to her days. But these thoughts grew softer, less insistent, as sleep began to gather around her like a gentle fog. Margaret let herself drift, let the day's concerns fall away, let her body sink into the comfort of the bed. The honey cake had been a gift, but not just the cake itself. The whole experience had been a gift. The finding of the recipe, the gathering of ingredients, the mixing and baking, the sharing, the connections made and strengthened. All of it had reminded Margaret of what mattered, had awakened her to the beauty already present in her life. She didn't need anything to change. She needed only to notice, to appreciate, to be present to the gifts that appeared each day. The warmth of the bakehouse, the scent of baking bread, the smile of a satisfied customer, the eagerness of a young apprentice, the quiet of evening, the comfort of rest. And now, dear listener, as Margaret settles into sleep, as the bakehouse rests dark and quiet below, as the town drifts into the peace of night, let us rest as well. Feel yourself settling, like dough resting between kneading, like ingredients coming together into a harmonious whole. There is no rush, no urgency. The work is done, the day is complete, and rest is earned and welcome. Breathe in slowly, like breathing in the scent of honey cake, warm spices and sweetness mingling in the air. Breathe out slowly, releasing the day's tensions, letting them go like steam rising from a fresh baked loaf. Think of the bakehouse, warm and safe, ready for tomorrow, but resting now. Think of the ovens cooling, the counters clean, the tools in their places, everything in order, everything at peace. You too can rest in order and peace. Let your body relax completely. Let your breathing slow to its natural rhythm. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be. Simply rest. The honey cake sits in its quiet darkness, its flavors deepening and mellowing, becoming more fully itself through the patient passage of time. You too can let this quiet darkness restore you, can let rest do its gentle work of renewal. Margaret sleeps peacefully in her bed, connected to all who came before and all who will come after, woven into the fabric of her community, held in the great pattern of care and continuity. You too are held, are connected, a part of something larger than yourself. Rest now. Let sleep come naturally, easily, like night following day, like stars emerging in the darkening sky. There is no effort required, no striving. Simply allow yourself to drift, to settle, to sink into the deep comfort of rest. The bakehouse will be there tomorrow, ready for new bread, new creations, new small acts of care and connection. But for now, all is quiet, all is well, all is at rest. Sleep, dear listener. Sleep peacefully, deeply, completely. Let the sweetness of rest fill you like honey, like love, like the gentle darkness that holds us all. Good night.